Okay, welcome to another episode of Thoughts and Bolts. I'm your host, Pedro Laveria, and we are continuing our seemingly never-ending series on the AAWSAP document leaks, specifically in this case, the 10-month report. This document should have been released through FOIA a long time ago, but as you've probably noticed through the series, you might imagine why that hasn't been the case. It has everything to do with crash retrievals. Okay. It's one thing to say UFOs are real. It's another thing to say that they are a technology created by non-human intelligence, and that seems to be the red line. Now, I've been focusing in the last few episodes on this one paragraph, right? Because, in the 500-page document, this is one of the most important paragraphs, right? It talks about the underground camouflage facility Bigelow Aerospace intended to act as a catcher's mitt for the non-human craft and materials in the possession of Lockheed Martin. Remember, OSAP was a Defense Intelligence Agency program, and again, it was being administered through this private contractor, Aerospace, because that's how business is done. Okay, none of this UFO stuff, at least not now, is done by the government directly. Um, and I'm speaking about crash retrievals, recovered hardware, biological samples from a non-human intelligence. It's all done through government contractors because that makes it immune to FOIA, right? So I've been focusing a lot on the part of this paragraph that deals with recovered hardware and which deals with biological samples from the corporate world. And in, our last few episodes, we showed that recovered hardware is a non-human craft and some scraps, materials from crashes, and it's being held by Lockheed Martin, okay, and almost certainly other companies as well. But I want to focus on this line right here. Oops, this line, okay. Now I'll read the whole sentence, but I'm going to focus on the part in red, okay. The need for, let me just check something on my sound here. Okay, sorry about that. Going back to the thing. The need for a highly secure underground vault operated by Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies became apparent in line with a boss priority to pursue and acquire recovered hardware and biological samples from the corporate world and or from private individuals and groups located elsewhere, including Brazil. Notice this part that I've been neglecting this whole series. And or from private individuals and groups located elsewhere. Okay. So we're not talking about the government and we're not talking about the corporate world. We're talking about private citizens. So the reason why this document is so important is because it is a primary source, okay, from the time period in question, which corroborates a lot of what the UFO whistleblowers like David Hodge, Commander Fravor and Lou Elizondo have been saying all these years. But to plan on getting this material, this exotic material, that needs to be stored in an underground base on behalf of the Defense Intelligence Agency, that this recovered material can be found in the hands of private individuals and groups is very interesting. Now, this is Lou Elizondo. Okay, he testified before Congress in last year's UFO hearings. And you can see there's a letter from Harry Reid saying that he ran ATIP, which was the successor program to OSAP. There's a lot of controversy as to the nature of this program. Was it truly the official successor to OSAP, or was it the OSAP alumni within DoD continuing the work secretly on the side, leveraging Lil Zondo's status as a super user of classified information in order to get videos they wanted of UAP so that they can continue that scientific study of the UFO phenomena. Okay. And there's a lot of controversy around that. I just posted this letter from Harry Reid that said, yeah, he was the head of ATIP. Okay, but whether you're a Lou supporter or a Lou hater, one thing no one denies and no one can deny because the evidence is overwhelming is that Lou Elizondo worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency for many, many years. Okay. And we know that OSAP was a DIA program being run by Bigelow Aerospace. So you have the DIA here in the form of OSAP. You have former DIA man in Lou Elizondo. This is also Lou Elizondo, here pictured with Chris Bledsoe and Tom DeLonge, the lead singer from Blink 182, and another band, Angels and Airwaves, which is really good. Now, there's Lou Elizondo with Chris Bledsoe. Who's Chris Bledsoe? Well, Chris Bledsoe is a UFO contactee. Okay. And he's one of the more popular UFO contactees right now. He has a very interesting case, a very strong case. And he wrote a book about it called UFO of God. And this is what Chris Bledsoe says about his interaction with Lou Elizondo. Okay? And I quote, after an interesting couple of days meeting with Tom and other wonderful people, I was on a plane headed back to North Carolina. I couldn't believe how just 4 years earlier I was ready to quit it all. A few months had passed, and it was early spring when Tom called to ask me about the metamaterial I and my two friends had. I told him I would work on it and get back to him. Eventually, I was able to convince Benny F. and Larry C. to meet with me and Tom in Columbus, Ohio. Lou Elizondo would be joining us as well. Benny, Larry, and I had in our possession metals that we witnessed dripping or being ejected from orbs. I met Tom and Lou at the airport in Columbus. I was happy to see them and had hopes the meeting would go well. We rented a car and headed to visit Benny and Larry. They were ecstatic to be having lunch with a famous rock star and Lou, who was at the time gaining popularity. Lou ended up receiving all of our off-world material and returned to California with Tom. The metals would go on to be tested in laboratories, and none of us, Benny, Larry, nor I, have seen them since. I was told the materials have been classified and will not be returned. Now, what's really interesting about this account is that this book came out, I believe, 2 years ago. And it's either last year or 2 years ago. And it came out before uh, these OSAP documents leaked like last month, right? And so what we have is an independent attestation, okay, of this idea, okay, that DIA affiliated peoples and organizations have interest in the exotic materials in the hands of private individuals or groups. When we mean exotic materials, we mean, alien stuff, okay? Because OSAP was a UFO program. ATIP was a UFO effort. Um, and Elizondo is a DIA man, or was for many, many years, right? And so that's interesting, right? Multiple independent attestation is an important thing, right? So here we have in these two examples are, you know, are facts, right? Claims, testimony, um, showing that once again, DIA affiliated groups and individuals have interest not just in the exotic materials that may have crashed in the desert and recovered by Lockheed, but also in that which is held by private individuals and groups. And in the case of Chris Bledsoe, we're talking about experiencers, UFO contactees. Mind you, Tom DeLonge and Lou aren't here to defend themselves. I'm not casting shade at them or, making any accusations. I'm just reporting what the historical record says. Now, how are we going to study metamaterials in this episode? Well, we're going to go with this formula that we learned and, goes back to Lockheed Martin. It's an oral tradition and it's verified by the VP of Lockheed Martin. If you watch this video at the 44-minute mark, if Jim Ryder talked about UFOs in terms of energy, consciousness, and form, where form is negotiable, as Ron Blackburn said he learned at the Lockheed Skunk Works, and so am I. That's the framework we're gonna use to kind of study this metamaterial question, this exotic material question, namely negotiable form, consciousness, and energy. One of these things that we always hear about these metamaterials is that they have negotiable form. Okay. Now, let's start with Diana Pasulka, Dr. Diana Pasulka, professor of religious studies at the Department of Philosophy and Religion at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. She wrote this book, American Cosmic, which is about the intersection between UFOs, religion, and technology. It was published by Oxford University Press. It's an excellent book. And her experience, she tells of her experience with a certain mysterious NASA guy named Timothy Taylor. Okay, in the book, she uses a pseudonym. Everyone's going to figure it out. It's this guy, Timothy Taylor. He's a NASA mission control guy. He's one of the best engineers. He wrote a book called Launch Fever, and he's a very successful entrepreneur. Okay, he has many different patents in the medical field. Okay, because apparently he's a material science guy. Um, And so Timothy Taylor approached Diana Pasulka, um, and he took her and Gary Nolan of Stanford University out to a UFO crash site in New Mexico. This crash happened in 1947, but it's not the Roswell crash. Timothy apparently knows the witness, who was a child at the time. Now, what's interesting is that at the same time this was happening, Jacques Vallée, who we talked about in a previous episode, was also snooping around the New Mexico desert. Okay. And if you read American Cosmic, you'll know that around this time, Jacques Vallée, Gary Nolan, and Diana Pasulka were hanging out a lot. Okay. And Jacques Vallée tells us he went to the plains of San Agustin. He was also snooping around at a UFO crash site in New Mexico from the 1940s. And when you combine the details of Diana Pasulka's crash site with Lay's crash site, by the way, two sites that they were both snooping around looking for exotic materials from these crashes, it's only one place that fits the bill, right? These two accounts come together like interlocking puzzle pieces, right? That crash site is none other than Verona site, okay, the Verona UFO crash. It also happened in the 1940s in New Mexico. It's not Roswell. It happened at the plains of San Augustine. Child witness Gerald Taylor gave his testimony as a grown man in the 90s. You can watch this testimony on the U.S. National Archives YouTube page. I really recommend it. It's a very moving account. Basically, we saw a crash flying saucer, right? When he was with his dad and his uncle, I believe, and there were bodies. I mean, and one of the beings, a non-human being, you know, reached out to him telepathically. You got to listen to it. But basically, they were at this crash site looking for stuff. Not just Diana Pasulka, Tim Taylor, and Gary Nolan, but in a different occasion on his own, Jacques Vallée. Okay, so this is the real deal. And Diana Pasulka and Gary Nolan found something. And so we're going to listen to Diana Pasulka's description of what they found on the JRE podcast.
And it would flat.
1 second. Let me get to exact. And we're ready to go.
kind of like outsourcing.
How big were these pieces?
So these pieces that I found weren't very big. I mean, they were about, one of them was about like this big, right?
Okay, like so the size of a pack of gum?
Yeah. And the actual frog skin type thing was probably about this big.
Like a small notebook?
And we found a couple of those.
Mm-hmm. You found a couple of those just wandering around this area?
Well, we weren't wandering. We were actually digging in
Right.
and looking. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Wandering's a bad word.
That's
but
okay.
Exploring.
Yeah.
This frog skin, what is it? Is it malleable? Is it?
Yes, it's malleable. And you could crunch it up and it'll go back to its original form.
I've heard of that before. That was something that they talked about at Roswell. That there was some bizarre metal that you could crumple up like a piece of paper and it would flatten right back out. And that's what you experienced?
I don't know if it was the same material, but yes.
Similar.
Yeah, it was like
What is
Okay, so Diana Pasulka, okay, testifies to having interacted with legendary memory metal. Okay, this time from the crash at St. Augustine. Let me go back to the slide in question. 1 second. Sorry about this. So there's Diana Pasulka. Now we're going to hear from Mac Brazel Jr. Mac Brazel Jr. is the son of Mac Brazel, who owned the property upon which the Roswell disk initially crashed. So if you know anything about the Roswell case, supposedly the flying saucer, crashed on his property, but it bounced, right? It bounced and it flew a few more miles to where it landed in its final resting place, right? And then it was recovered and all that sort of thing. But because it initially made contact with his property, right? It bounced off his property before flying off and finally crashing and resting. There was a debris field, and then that debris was collected by the Army. But according to Mac Brazel Jr., they didn't collect everything because he was about 18 or 20 years old, and he went out on his horse to where the Army was, covering everything once everyone was gone, of course, and he found a piece, and he talked about what that was like. So let's go to Mac Brazel Jr. and hear what it was like.
And then the foil, like tin foil or lead foil, but you couldn't crease it and make it stay. And I only had one little jagged piece of it. And you bend it over, make a crease, and it'd straighten right back out. And it wouldn't, I don't know, it had to hit with a terrific force because you couldn't cut that wood or the string or the foil.
So there you go. Once again, the same type of phenomenology, right? You have this strange metallic piece of metal that you can bend it, make a crease. You could crumple it up in your hand, let it go, and then it goes back to its original form. If you're a UFO person, you know about this. You've known about this for decades, but these videos are also for the newcomers. Here's Frankie Rowe. Frankie Rowe is the daughter of a Roswell firefighter, and she tells the story of being a little girl during these tumultuous days after the Roswell crash. And she tells her story of having seen the memory metal as well in the fire station. So let's go to Frankie Rowe's testimony. And here we go.
Went back to work with Daddy. He came home at noon and picked me up on his lunch. And I had gone to the doctor and was sitting in the kitchen part of the fire station. And I was eating a glass of ice chips. And a state policeman came in and he yelled at Daddy. He said, "Hey, Dan, come over here." And he said, "Get all the guys. I want to show you guys something." The state policeman reached into his pocket and he said, "I don't think you guys got to see anything like this the other day." And he pulled his hand out of his pocket and it was closed up. He opened his hand over the table and dropped a piece of material that when it hit the table, It was all wadded up when it left his hand, and when it hit the table, it spread out like it was water. And they were asking him, how'd you get by with this? And he said, well, he had helped with some of the pickup of debris, and he had managed to sneak that one piece in his pocket. He said, I don't know how long I'll get to keep this before I get caught.
So there you go. There's our third witness, right? So we have three witnesses, two of them from the 1940s and one from, our day and age, talking about interacting with this kind of material, which was found at the crash sites. Okay. And as I mentioned earlier, with regards to our approach to this whole subject of metamaterials, exotic materials, we're talking about them in the terms of negotiable form, consciousness, and energy. And so the negotiable form stuff, think it's pretty self-explanatory, right? This stuff can retain its original form after it's let go. Now, let's talk about consciousness, okay? In terms of mundane substances, the closest thing we have as an analog to the Roswell material is something called nitinol. Okay, but before I get into nitinol, I want to talk about one of the DIRDs, Defense Intelligence Reference Documents, that was produced by AAWSAP. You can read the aerospace applications of programmable matter DIRD on DIA FOIA. It's under the UFO and exotic technology section. I kid you not. Go on DIA FOIA, go to the UFO and exotic technology section, and you can read the DIRD on aerospace applications of programmable matter. Programmable matter is a new genre of dynamic materials called smooth materials, which can self-repair, self-assemble, shapeshift, change function, perform programmed functions over a wide range of electromagnetic or other environmental conditions. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that the AAWSAP people were expecting to receive from Lockheed. Otherwise, why would you write this DIRD? Now, again, the San Augustine and the Roswell crashes happened in 1947, and the very mundane material known as nitinol was produced by the Navy Ordnance Lab in 1959, so literally 10 years after. So there are those in the UFO community who suspect that nitinol is a cheap human knockoff of the Roswell material, and there's reason to suspect this might actually be the case. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is where the Roswell disc was taken after the crash, and it was home to the Battelle Memorial Institute. And as early as the 1952, they were experimenting with titanium-based alloys. Now, nitinol was developed at the U.S. Naval Ordnance Laboratory, okay? But the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, which was called the White Oak Laboratory, closed, and it was merged with the Naval Weapons Lab at Dahlgren, Virginia, becoming half of the Naval Surface Warfare Center. Why is that important? Well, if you go on UFO, CIA FOIA, if you go on the CIA FOIA database, you can find this document. It is a report of a parapsychology conference in Reykjavik, Iceland. Okay, it was a 5-day meeting with scientists from the United States, France, Great Britain, Denmark, and Sweden. And they presented laboratory data confirming the existence of the human mind as playing a role in the physical events. And it just turns out that a researcher at the U.S. Naval Surface Weapons Center's White Oak Laboratory talked about his experiments on the extraordinary ability of a wide variety of geographically dispersed subjects to alter the properties of nitinol. Why is this important? Well, essentially the same laboratory, okay, that developed nitinol, okay, because remember, When this lab closed, it was merged with a different lab, okay, and it became the Naval Surface Warfare Center. Okay, it became half of the Naval Surface Warfare Center. The same laboratory, okay, that developed nitinol also had scientists running telekinesis experiments with nitinol. Why would they do that? Well, one possibility is that nitinol really is a cheap human knockoff of the Roswell material. And if it is a cheap human knockoff of the Roswell material and has similar properties vis-a-vis negotiable form, then perhaps it might have similar properties vis-a-vis psychotronics. Psychotronics being the Soviet term for parapsychology. So again, if nitinol is a cheap knockoff of the Roswell material and shares its negotiable form properties, then maybe it shares its psychotronic properties, its consciousness related properties. And that would explain why scientists from the same lab that developed it also were doing telekinesis experiments on it. Which brings me to consciousness. Okay. This is Harold Momgren, senior aide to 4 U.S. presidents. Okay. JFK, LBJ, Nixon, and Ford. Above is his daughter, Pippa Momgren, okay, who was special assistant to President George W. Bush. And in her Substack, she talks about his experience with UFOs in the capacity as a government official. You can read it for yourself, but essentially it all revolves around the Bluegill Triple Prime nuclear tests when the United States government fired some nukes into the atmosphere in the Pacific and apparently knocked down a UFO. They were called tag-alongs. Okay. And so they knocked down the UFO, and part of it, the recovered materials, were taken to the Los Alamos laboratory. Okay. So I'm just going to quote Pippa Momgren. She says, "My dad said it was the first time we knocked the tag-along out of the sky. It was historic. So he flew out to, let me see, I'm using that. He flew out to Albuquerque to be briefed by the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, Lawrence Geis, who apparently received materials from the crash craft. He kept them on his desk, handed them to my dad, and then asked him to describe how he felt. Dad said a voice began talking to him inside his head. That's all Geis wanted to know. Dad never recalled or would not say what the voice said. Apparently, he said, some people interact with the materials and others don't." Okay. So, mind you, that is a secondhand account. That's not from Harold Momgren himself, but rather through his daughter. But it's significant, right? Because you have this high-ranking official going to Los Alamos, and he handled the material from the Bluegill Triple Prime test, okay, this UFO that the government knocked out of the sky, first time ever. And it had a psychotronic effect on him, right? He heard voices when he held it. And apparently, this kind of material interacts with some people, but it doesn't interact with other people. But if you want a first-hand account, again, let's go back to Diana Pasulka and go back one more step to Tim Taylor. Why did a NASA mission control guy who knows where to find exotic materials from crashes in the 1940s, why did he approach a scholar of religion? This is what he said, quote, "I have mentors in the space program. One of them, who is now retired, explained that the next discovery in my field is going to come from your field. I'm at the limit of understanding what I can from a materialist perspective. My mentor explained that mysticism, religion, and consciousness is where I need to go to learn what's next. That the mind-machine interface is the next frontier." Okay, that's a quote from American Cosmic. Now that's Tim Taylor. That's Chris Bledsoe and Tim Taylor. Okay. So not just Lou Elizondo, but now we have another spook interacting with Chris Bledsoe. And I say spook, I don't mean derogatively. Okay. So this is what Chris Bledsoe says about their interaction. Tim reached into his backpack and pulled out another container. He took another piece of metal out of it. This one is similar matte, dark gray, but looked a bit wrinkled like aluminum foil. Then Tim demonstrated that it had an unusual property. It could be wrinkled and creased in the same manner as tin foil, but afterward would be perfectly smoothed out as if it had never been wrinkled in the first place. With the silver gray piece in my left hand, he placed this second scrap of metal in my right. Out of nowhere, energy jolted through me. My eyes darkened with tunnel vision, as if I had gone into G-lock in a fighter jet. What is that? I managed to say, despite my racing heart. I noticed my forearm pulsing. Why you? Why you? Tim asked. So again, now we have a fourth witness of this kind of anomalous metal material, this memory metal. But now, not only do we have the psychotronic aspect, which is similar to what Harold Momgren experienced, but now we have the question of energy, right? And that's the third part of this. Birds, aerospace applications of programmable matter. Talked about this one earlier. Okay. Programmable materials can also be used to harvest, store, and redirect other forms of energy. Spacecraft are constantly bathed in a very high solar energy flux and experience sharp temperature gradients, as well as periodic changes in magnetic and electric fields. All of these represent possible energy sources that can be scavenged from the environment without disrupting other spacecraft operations. So, one of the things the OSAP people apparently were interested in was the energy scavenging properties of these mesomaterials. Otherwise, why produce the dirt on programmable matter? And if we go back to the advanced space propulsion based on vacuum engineering dirt, which I think is the leading theory for how something like a tic tac flies, um, in order to, warp space time, okay, in order to make the space in front of a craft shrink and the space behind the craft expand, you need energy densities predicted. The predicted energy densities exceed by many orders of magnitude values achievable with existing engineering techniques, right? In other words, these materials, whatever the craft is made out of, right, it has to be able to withstand these intense energy densities. Now, I'm not a physicist or an engineer, but it seems to me that these materials need to be extremely durable, right? Kind of materials that don't melt, right? When, uh, storing or conducting these kinds of energy densities, right? So there you go. Energy, consciousness, and negotiable form. We've covered all three. Um, if anybody reading this or watching this is an electrical engineer of any kind, it sounds to me that Chris Bledsoe Sr.'s body acted as some kind of circuit, right? So you have, the positive and the negative, you know, perhaps in one hand positive, the other hand negative, and these materials are extracting from what? Quantum vacuum, 0 point energy, right? And his body's acting as the circuit, and that's why he had that kind of that jolting effect, right? I don't know. I'm speculating. I'm not an engineer or physicist, but it's all very interesting. And again, for all this information, I always try to get as many independent sources as possible. Okay. But these OSAP documents are very important, and so is everything written by people surrounding that program from the same time period. Okay, because context is king. Now, I always like to leave my shows with an exhortation to remember that consciousness is not classified. Mystery of mysteries is nearer to you than your own heartbeat. Okay? And that is simply your awareness and the awareness of your awareness and the awareness of the awareness of your awareness, right? Uh, Study that, learn about that, experience that, experiment with that, and you'll understand more about the UFO phenomenon than by doing anything else. Good night.